Welcome to the Coastal Stoic. My name is Craig Bell. I live on the coast of Florida, central east coast to be specific. I'm sitting here in my tiki hut on the canal, looking at the boat and the dogs, and just want to introduce myself and the channel. And the Coastal Stoic is a channel that is pretty much for storytelling and thinking. It's not a place where I'm going to bring up Marcus Aurelius or Seneca and talk about their quotes and that type of thing. There's so many places out there for that. What I want to do is I want to speak to you about stories and events that have happened in my life and other people's lives, and tell those stories and connect those stories to us and to how we might interpret things that happen in our lives to how to better our lives. And in doing that, I found that the tenets of Stoicism are, in retrospect, as I look back at the past of my life, have been Stoic events and Stoic lessons. So, thus the name, the Coastal Stoic. I am no Marcus Aurelius for sure, and you will be certain of that. But I hope you enjoy the journey, and I hope you engage, and I hope that you provide some comments and some feedback, positive, negative. Just don't be unkind. This will be a positive space, a non-political space, but a space for thinking and stories, and I hope that you join me on this journey. One of my favorite all-time stories, hearing and then reading, is Dr. Seuss's Horton Hears a Who. There's just so much goes on in that thing, and I'm not going to tell that story, but I'm going to set this next story up with Horton, because here's this dude, this elephant dude, cruising through the world. He's got these big ears so he can hear things, and then he hears this voice, this small voice from a speck of dust, and he protects it at all costs. Fights and fights and fights to protect this voice that nobody else can hear but him. And then he saves it because they all come together and people can finally hear this voice in Whoville. But I find it just compelling that our presence, our space, our perspective is that. It's layered. So are we the dust? Are we Horton? Are we I think there are monkeys who are trying to boil the dust, and thus the Who's in Whoville. I don't know which we are, but perspective plays a huge part in all of these things. And one of the lessons in perspective that I found is back as a young man with quite the ego, hanging out with a bunch of other young people with pretty significant, strong egos. Some older, very few younger than myself. Some old, most of them older, are in my age group, early 20s, so we're talking mid 80s, late 80s. We used to run charter boats, liveaboard dive boats to be specific, from West Palm to the Bahamas. Mostly we would check in to, say, West End, Grand Bahama. It's about a 60-mile run out of Lake Worth Inlet in Florida to the Bahamas. But in the process of making the crossing, you have to cross the Gulf Stream. So the Gulf Stream is just a couple miles outside of Lake Worth Inlet, and depending on the day, it's 20, 30 miles wide, if not more. It has a bottom, it has sides, and it's this current that cruises out of the Gulf of Mexico around the eastern seaboard and up over to Europe, actually, eventually. But for our purposes here, we ran boats. They ran from 40 feet up to 100 feet. And the passengers would come on, check in, put their stuff, stow their stuff, and get maybe a couple drinks, and then go to bed. And then middle of the night, early in the morning, midnight, 1 in the morning or so, we would crank the engines up, untie from the dock, and off we go to the Bahamas. And on this journey, crossing the Gulf Stream, we would sometimes have perfect conditions. When I say perfect conditions, the ocean, and over 60 miles of the ocean in the Gulf Stream, you'd have some wind or breeze usually, and you might have anything from 2-foot seas to 10-foot seas, depending on, and higher, of course, but typically did not go out and higher than that. But sometimes you'd untie from the dock and there wouldn't be a stitch of wind. And you get out of the inlet and you start cruising, and it was like a lake, like just a sheet of glass. Now we're in the middle of the night, early morning, and there might be without the wind. Typically, it's very clear, so there's tons of stars, maybe a full moon or partial moon that you see. You're steering by, like, and sometimes on full moons, like the moon would just be a spot. So sometimes the conditions were just perfect, so glassy that the moon would be just a spot, not like a line like you oftentimes see like on a sunrise or sunset where it trails off. Like it would just be a dot, a white spot on the ocean. It'd be so flat and calm and beautiful. And in order to check our egos, because as mentioned before, we had quite the egos, a bunch of young men running charter boats, and young people, I should say, because they're men and women, running charter boats and working on these boats and playing with sharks and free diving deep. We thought we were all that, and we really weren't. But we thought we were. But sometimes we'd have to check our egos and give ourselves a different perspective. So on these nights, at times, crossing the Gulf Stream, if we had the right crew and the right group and we had left at the right time, we would just, in the middle of the Gulf Stream in 3,000 feet of water, stop the boat, go to the back, and take turns and put our scuba gear on, and then jump in the water with a line, with a float ball that has a chem light so the boat could find us. And we'd all just grab hold of this line and then just submerge down, let the air out of our BCs, and go down to about 100 feet of water. So we're in the middle of the Gulf Stream, in the middle of the night, black outside, and the only lights the lights we're holding. And when we get to 100 feet, 120 feet, we just turn those off. So the only light that we have is anything from up above that we can see from the boat, if you will, 100 feet above us, or maybe the moon at times, or the glow of our gauges. And we would just float. 100, 110 feet, over 3,000 feet of water. And just think, the only thing we hear is our breathing, sound like Darth Vader on the scuba down deep, bubbles coming past our faces and our ears as we're exhaling, maybe the hum of the engine of the boat above us, up there on the surface. And that's it. And you think about it and you're like, holy moly, I'm nothing. I'm floating out here. There are fish and mammals out here that could consume us. Like, we're bait. We're garbage. Like, there are massive sharks out there. There are massive marlin. There are massive the pilot whales. And recently, now killer whales off the Bahamas that I had not seen before or heard of before. But that's even happening now. But back then, no. But you get into a space to where you're thinking, I am just a speck of dust floating. And similar to the dust in that Horton Hears a Who story, like, you're insignificant in the whole of the thing, but in the moment and the place and your crew, like, your universe, you're something for sure. But as we're floating there, we thought, this is sketch. And then eventually somebody would turn their light on, or we'd run out of bottom time and we'd have to come up, and we'd take our time getting up. But invariably after these trips, and we didn't do it a ton of times, but maybe a half a dozen times over a few years, in doing that, we get all dried off, we get rinsed off, and we start heading back towards the Bahamas. And I'd be on the bridge, whichever boat it was, and after we had done it, I would just be caught in a silence, caught in a space of, like, what just happened? And that ego that I had is dialed back, a humility, a humble component to my life and to the world around me would just, I don't know, just kind of swell up and be part of who I was. Because I wasn't as significant to the world as I thought I was and the world that I lived in. And that's it. Now, we can extrapolate, we can pull things out, and we say, oh, wait a second. So you weren't, but who heard your voice? Like, who heard the Who's voice from Whoville? Well, it was Horton, of course. So is this maybe an opportunity for me to have a voice where people hear me? Possibly. Was education and with my classrooms over the past couple of decades, teaching in classrooms, these students coming in, is that the opportunity for my voice to be heard? I guess, in a sense. But our voices need to be used, but the reality is that we're only small parts in this immense city, state, country, nation, world, universe. And our reality is that we're not here for an enormously long time, and some people not long at all. So that humility and that ego check periodically was something we needed. Something similar happened later. So after I got out of running the charters, my wife and I, we moved to Colorado, and a friend of mine, Steve, and I, we go camping, and we would go backpacking up in the high country in the northern Colorado Rocky Mountains called the Raywah Wilderness, Rawah. I'm probably mispronouncing it. I'm sorry if I am. However, we would go hiking, and it'd be several miles up to our campsite. We try to get there at the first thaw, and we're going up through these aspen groves till we get to the base of the climb we're going to make. And we'd have to go into goat gear, and we're about a mile up this very steep path, and we'd be tired. And say we're at 10,000 feet, maybe 11,000 feet, and we drop our packs and go sit on these big boulders that kind of overlook this valley that went so far down. But you could see like one range, like mountains all over. And the two of us, we realized we're out there. There were no cars at the parking area. There's nobody. We would go for a week and not see another human being. We would see moose and whatnot. But you sit on this boulder and you look over there, having a snack, having a drink of water, and Steve and I, we'd just be silent. And it seemed like almost simultaneously we would look at each other and say, wow, like, there's so much, and we're so small, and it's so massive. And how do you process that? Because we're raised thinking that we're so important. And to be true, to be fair, we are. To my wife and my kids and my grandkids and my friends and my students, yeah, we're important in that confined space. But in the whole of it, not so much. And even in that confined space, it's a passing thing. So with this, I want us to be thinking about perspective. I want us to think about how we see ourselves in the world and how we situate ourselves in the world. And before we think it's all about me, or it's all about what I think or what I want, think about what is the validity, what is the value of what it is that you want, and what's the impact, and how do we need to engage in this life in a way that's going to make it significant, to where our voices can be heard, like the Who's, if you will. So that's my story for the day, about diving into the middle of the ocean and floating around like bait and wondering what might come chomp us. And nobody ever got hurt on these. Nobody ever was overly traumatized, I don't believe. But I will tell you that it was a humbling experience, both in the ocean and in the mountains. And I hope that you get to experience that isolation and that feeling of humility to check our egos, because I think we need that from time to time. Well, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And if so, please come back. I'll be trying to post these once a week. And I look forward to your comments. If there are any comments to be had, if you have any suggestions on improvements, please put them in the comments. I am new to this and I'm looking forward to a fun and energetic journey. Thank you so much. Have a great day.